Hey everyone, it's a new week. That means it's time for Sysadmin Weekly. On this week's episode, Eric and I sit down and we talk about all things Azure Local. Now, you may or may not have known that Azure Local is kind of the rebranded name for Azure Stack HCI. We talk about what the differences are. We talk about what Azure Local really is, what features are present within Azure Local, why you might want to use it, and lots more on today's episode of Sysadmin Weekly. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sysadmin Weekly Podcast, the podcast by sysadmins for sysadmins and those folks who are working tirelessly in the trenches day in and day out. Of course, being a sysadmin tends to be a thankless job, right? Whether you're on-prem or in the cloud. So this podcast is for you. My name is Andy Syrewicze, and with me is my partner in crime, I've got Eric Siron. How's it going, Eric?
Hey Andy, how you doing? I'm good.
Doing good. Hey, this is episode 2, and people are gonna, scratch their heads because it's 001. But remember, in IT, we start at the number 0. So, it's gonna be hard keeping track of that as we keep going. So, it's gonna be episode 050, and it's gonna be episode 51. So
That'll be the Easter egg hunt where people go find the times we're off.
No, I'm going to have to watch that. I'm going to have to actually say this is episode 001. So this is episode 001, not to disregard me saying 2. Anyway, today we're talking about Azure Local. But before we get into that, some of our usual housekeeping stuff here. Again, we want this show to be interactive. We would love to hear comments, questions, funny jokes from you guys if you're interested. Like I said in the last episode of the show, I'm still kind of weighing what that looks like long term. I'm thinking a Discord group right now off the top of my head. But in the meantime, you can reach us at contact@sysadminweekly.com. That will land you right in our inboxes. And like I said, if you have a comment or a question or something you'd like us to cover on the show, by all means, drop us an email and we'll get back to you. So, well, Eric, Azure Local. Interesting topic. We heard a lot about it at Microsoft Ignite. You and I were both there. It was a good trip, by the way. It was good being back in person at a Microsoft show. I enjoyed it anyway. I think you liked it as well, if I remember correctly.
Really good time. And the interesting about the conferences and why I'm a big believer in being in person is the people that I met were so much better than any of the sessions that I attended. And honestly, I didn't even attend that many sessions because I wound up just like, oh, look, here's someone else with a very interesting story or career or something. And I met so many just wonderful people there. And oh, yeah, absolutely. It was a wonderful time.
That's the one thing I will say about the Microsoft community is everybody's been so helpful and welcoming. I've always had good experiences with this community, especially, like you said, going to the conferences and stuff. And I think same for me. I spent a little bit of time doing some volunteering for some of the Microsoft community booths. But, it didn't feel like volunteer work because I was getting to talk with other IT folks and hearing stories. And it was a good time. And same as you, I think maybe I went to 4 sessions all week. And I've got an old friend who used to, well, he still says, the really helpful sessions are the quote-unquote hallway sessions, right? Those, like you said, those conversations that you have, those people you meet, those connections you make, definitely are, that's the real good thing about those in-person conferences, typically. So that was a good one. And we actually talked to a couple of folks there we may have to have on the show for some quick interviews. I'm thinking of
Yes.
Simon Bender for one, because we're going to mention AVD here. We're also Azure Virtual Desktop. We may also mention Windows Recall. Simon would be a good resource for both those topics while I'm thinking of it. So I'm going to have to ping that guy. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of ourselves here. I'm talking about something that's not even in this episode. So anyway, what do you think? Should we talk about Azure Local? All right. So the first thing I want to talk about is answer the question of what is Azure Local. And I'm fairly certain I said this in the last, the very first episode of the show. It's amazing how often I talk about this, and that is the fact that Microsoft historically is terrible at naming things. And so why I say that is Azure Local is really a rebranding of Azure Stack HCI. Not to be confused with Azure Stack, not to be confused with Azure. And so this is where people always end up getting confused. Most people, if they're not really familiar with what the Microsoft Cloud Stack, they see Azure Stack HCI and they just assume it's some Azure thing. Because let's face it, every time you log into the Azure portal, there's a notification about some new service or offering that is now either in public preview or GA, right? There's always something new. So people hear names like Azure Stack HCI and they just assume it's some Azure thing. And of course, like I said, not to be confused with Azure Stack, which is an entirely different product line. And Azure Stack HCI was basically all of those on-premises Windows Server technologies that we've all known and loved for all these years. It contains Hyper-V, storage spaces direct, software-defined networking, all that stuff packaged up into one bundle. Well, they've now rebranded that as Azure Local. And it's interesting, Azure Stack HCI is still referenced in some of the Azure Local docs as I was prepping for this episode. It actually called out the Azure Stack HCI OS, the Azure Stack HCI operating system, which is, come on, who are we kidding? It's Windows Server under the hood, right? Some modified version of Windows Server, of course. And so to confuse things even more, now we have the Azure Stack HCI OS. Like I said, that was in one of the docs, one of the Learn docs I came across prepping for this episode. And so Azure Local, again, it's rebranded Azure Stack HCI. And to be honest, I just got done disparaging them for their naming practices. I think Azure Local is a much, much better name than Azure Stack HCI because it tells me exactly what I'm getting. Azure Local, right? What are your thoughts on the naming convention here, Eric? I think we're of like minds on that, but I could be wrong.
Yes. As bad as Azure Stack HCI was, Azure Local is such a breath of fresh air, and almost makes you wonder why did it take them so long to go, oh wait, I have an idea. So whoever did that deserves a medal because yes, that's perfect and simple. It's obviously doesn't tell the complete story, but man, it's so much less effort because people would watch Azure Stack HCI, then you have to deprogram. Okay, Stack doesn't mean anything. HCI, yeah, but that's not really the core of what it is. So you have to deprogram what they hear in the name, and then after you do that, then you have to go back and explain what it actually is. At least with Azure Local, both Azure and Local are correct, and you don't have to overthink them. Yeah, it's so much better.
Right. And so I want to build on the description there, right? So again, Azure Local contains Hyper-V. It contains storage spaces direct, which is the hyper-converged storage system inside of the Windows Server ecosystem. That's what allows me to scale storage and compute at the same time, right? So I'm actually utilizing that storage within the same chassis that my virtual machines are running from, or the same cluster, right, that my virtual machines are running from. And again, you get all the software-defined networking, bells and whistles, which there's some really cool stuff in the server networking stack. It occurs to me we should probably do an episode entirely about SDN because there is so much cool stuff that they've added to the stack in the last 5 years that is worth talking about, in my opinion. Sidebar. So we'll have to do that, Eric.
Part of Azure Local product, so there you go.
That's right. So, and I think the other thing I really want to mention here is I've already mentioned what's contained in the product, but it also gets tied into the Azure management control plane. So this ties in with Azure Arc, and it allows me to manage that on-premises resource that is Azure Local from the Azure portal. And now I'm I'm treating it, I'm working with it as if it was another Azure resource. So now I'm unifying the management experience, and there's all kinds of really cool things that we can do about that. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the episode here. So I think that does it for like the core idea of it. And anything you want to add, Eric, before we get into the benefits and kind of what we see are the key use cases?
Why don't we hit on the things I'm thinking as we go across them? Because I think most things I'm thinking are going to segue with that.
Yeah, that's kind of what I had in mind too. So let's go into the benefits, right? Because anytime some new thing comes out, if I'm an administrator, I've got an established solution in my environment already, right? It's working. I've got a patching process built around it. Why should I change? What's the benefit? Why should I go through that pain? And realistically, I think if it was me, I don't know as if I'd be like, oh my God, switch to Azure Local, like right now, today, tomorrow, right? It would certainly be on my radar for the next refresh cycle, right? But, I don't think you have to, there's no burning urgent reason to go switch today, right now, in my opinion. And so when we talk about benefits, going through my list here, the big one for me is you get Hyper-V and all of the mature ecosystem that's behind it, right? Not only Hyper-V, but Storage Spaces Direct. You get all the benefits of those platforms. And I think there's a lot of organizations that are currently having to switch virtualization platforms. A little bit of a sidebar, but I'm gonna bring it back, and it'll make sense in a second here. There's a lot of organizations that are having to switch away from VMware right now. These organizations are used to VMware tools. They're used to that stack and working with it. Switching to another hypervisor, another virtualization solution is difficult because you have to learn the tooling, right? You have to learn the tooling, the patch process. The beauty I see of Azure Local is it contains all those products and features, assuming I'm not a VMware only admin, but it contains all those products and features that I'm already used to in the Microsoft ecosystem, especially if I've been managing Azure day in and day out. So now I get those on-premises local options, but in a package that I'm already used to working with. And so I don't have to learn any tooling, which is a big plus for me, in my opinion. Not only that, being as it is kind of the Windows Server still around and is going to be around. I want to make sure I mention that. But Microsoft, at least in my opinion, has kind of indicated that Azure Local will be, how do I want to say it, and again, this is just my opinion, I'm not speaking for anyone, but I think Azure Local is going to be where most of the on-premises development focus goes. I think Windows Server will still get updates on that cadence that we've been used to seeing over the years, but I think, in my opinion, I'm guessing Azure Local will get a little bit faster cadence. I don't know. What are your thoughts? Like I said, that's an opinion of mine, Eric, but what do you think?
That tracks. I kind of get caught up in a lot of discussions around things, and I think people in our line of work kind of miss that for admins in the field. Like if you walk into a data center, Azure Local, whatever it's doing, whatever its presence is going to always, at best, take second place to the application servers. So the idea that Windows Server would ever go away, it would only be even possible if Linux could pop in and take care of and fill the gap, which it's not even close to being able to do right now, and not for any fault of it, but our vendors that push those line of business applications are developing on Windows Server. And they're not going to probably anytime soon release something that would run directly on Azure or Azure Local. So we are going to have Windows Server with our application servers on it, and they may be guests on Azure Local, or they may be running on hardware, or they may be running on Hyper-V, or, I hear in Europe a lot of people are, Proxmox is really taking off, so on and so forth. But your instance, so if how about we do this? How about in your server, the number of kernels you have running, most of them are going to be running traditional server kernels, not fancy new hypervisor or hypervisor adjacent, whatever, for the foreseeable future. And then even at that point, when that mass starts to change, I wonder if we're going to then just go to container based, right? So you're still going to need your traditional kernels that have nothing to do with Hyper-V, Azure Local, so on and so forth.
It's funny you mention the container-based, because you can actually run AKS, Azure Kubernetes Service. You can run that on top of Azure Local. So if I want an in-house Kubernetes service, Kubernetes cluster via AKS, I can do that.
Can do that.
I don't know. Have you ever tried to set up Kubernetes, like a Kubernetes cluster by scratch, Eric?
Oh Lord, no.
So I
I've
don't know
heard
if
enough from other people that no, thanks. I think I'd rather do a Gen 2 thing all by myself than.
I don't know if I hate myself or what, but I tried it one time. I think
Yeah,
I
but
was
then you also tried, didn't you stand up a Gen 2 environment too? I think you're a
Oh yeah,
little.
I've installed Gentoo Linux many times over the
Yeah,
years.
uh-huh.
We're gonna have to do a whole episode about that, because that's an adventure, man. And I will say, if you want to really learn how Linux works, if you want to learn way more about it than you ever wanted to, go install Gentoo. I think the only more from source distribution you can get is Arch. Arc.
That
Arc
sounds right.
Linux.
Arch. Yeah,
Yeah,
I think it's Arch. I'm pretty sure it's pronounced that way. But yeah, yeah.
I love that distribution, but when it takes an hour to compile a package upgrade, like, uh, yeah, I'm out.
I mean, at the same time, you install server, Windows Server, whatever, and then the very first patch you put on it is an hour. Like, why
Ugh,
can I install it from scratch and it takes 5 minutes to install Windows Server and then an hour to patch it, setting it 100%? What is that? What are you doing?
right. Good times. Well, pulling us back on the rails here, I would love to go down that rabbit hole more, but for the purposes of the episode, let's talk about key use cases. We've kind of talked about the benefits a little bit, right? You know, you get the industry-leading virtualization platform, unified management experience, all the benefits of some of those Azure services running local now, AKS, like I just said, Azure Virtual Desktop. That's actually number one on my list of key use cases here. AVD, for those aren't familiar, that's Azure Virtual Desktop. That is a VDI solution, right? A virtual desktop infrastructure solution. So, Eric, I know that you have done a lot with VDI over the years in various ways, shapes, or forms. Any initial thoughts on AVD on top of Azure Local for, replacing a VDI implementation that you have today?
Yeah, so I have done Citrix DAS and I have done the traditional Microsoft RDS with Hyper-V. And so Microsoft is kind of like, I'm not even really sure. Like, let's say they have unofficially stopped developing RDS in a way because it really hasn't matured at all in 3 or 4, maybe
It's been
5
a
versions.
while, yeah.
And it does its thing. There's honestly, if you're jumping into it new, it seems really deep and complex. And the more I play with it, the more I realize it's really, there's just not that much going on. It's really not that heavy of a solution. Uh, the competition is really expensive, but they do have better tooling, better management experiences. So AVD is kind of coming in that nice little middle ground where you get it's not that complicated and you get the Microsoft. I'm not really sure kind of where I'm going. I guess it's kind of the better together. Everything just kind of works. It's everything you're familiar with. You get the Azure control plane, you get all that, and you don't spend nearly as much money as you do on these third-party solutions. One really nice benefit of it that you can't get from anybody else is multi-session Windows 10, Windows 11. Nobody
Mm.
else can do that. Nobody, and I'm not sure what the story is there, is like, because it seems like no one else can do it legally. So I don't know how that goes on.
uh,
Yeah, so you can save a ton of money on because VDI, as I've been trying to explain to people for years, is not usually a cost savings endeavor. It is
No.
about I need this different kind of functionality. Like you can keep you can draw your security boundary around your data center and retain that regardless of where people are connecting from, things of that nature. So it's the feature set that you're after, not saving money. But with multi-session Windows 11 with just the general and the expense on it. Like if you look at AVD, and I want to be very careful to not sit here and give you pricing. However, it is much cheaper than almost every other solution you're going to look at. So, and you get all the extra benefits that, and honestly, if I were to sit here and start listening, I'm going to mess a bunch. But I know that a few that I've been kind of excited about are GPU partitioning, which is a Hyper-V feature. But then, of course, goes down into now, okay, so we've got a radiology user who needs to look at high definition images in their VDI. Cool, I can do that. And I can, depending on the solution I pick, I can maybe do it inexpensively, comparable to what I would spend on a very nice workstation for them. But they can access it from anywhere they happen to be. So yeah,
I
I
think,
kind of hear myself kind of cheerleading for AVD here, but in a way, yeah, it's kind of
well, I think for me, if I put my sysadmin hat on here, GPU partitioning, like you just said, I think that's a game changer for VDI, basically, right? For any VDI solution, being able to carve off part of a GPU and give it to a user that needs it, that's huge. Um,
amazing.
I spent a lot of time in the manufacturing space, so when I think of those graphics heavy users, I always think of CAD engineers.
Mhm.
The CAD engineers are very, very particular about their hardware, and with good reason, right? CAD is, and all the CAD adjacent applications are very system heavy, right? And so being able to give them a virtual desktop that they can use as like a secondary machine to access while they're out of the office or whatever, and not have to pull those CAD files off site or over VPNs or whatever, I think is a,
Absolutely.
a huge win.
And you were there
So,
at the AMD booth with me, weren't you? They had one on display there that you
but
can
yeah,
buy and put in your data center and run AVD on it. And they were showing they're RDP'd into multiple sessions and they're running like, I forget what it was. It was one of those graphics benchmarks things that was really impressive. And they're running multiple sessions of it. And not only, they're sitting there and their big thing that they were trying to say is like, look, let's see how quiet this is. See how we have this this data center grade server sitting here doing all this work on the show floor and you can't hear it. And if you put your hand in front of the egress vents, that's not hot and everything. And one of the things I was caught on to is like, and if you go out to Azure and you select this virtual machine, whatever, that is the hardware that it's running on. That box right there is what it's running on. And I'm like, that's amazing. So when we're talking about bringing Azure into your data center, that's what we're doing. We're
yeah,
not even, it's not an exaggeration. So it's
that's
really impressive.
for sure, for sure. Yeah, I remember that. That's I'm guessing you probably have a web link to that specific system. I'm guessing you probably have that bookmarked somewhere. Maybe, possibly.
Yeah, you caught me flat-footed. I do have it, but I'm not really sure where it is. But yes,
Right,
I
right.
did absolutely save that because
Yeah,
oh,
no
I love
worries, no worries. The reason I ask is it was so cool. I think it's worth sharing with listeners. So folks watching slash listening to this episode, take a look in the show notes. I want to include a link to that because it was a really cool system too. I think what was it? It was like 2U if I remember correctly. It wasn't
yeah, it
like
was not big at
massive.
all. Mm-mm,
Yeah,
mm-mm, well, not big
it
at all.
was pretty impressive, and I think like they had 2 or 3 RDP sessions just right there streaming the various benchmarking applications, like you said. It was it was impressive. I hear a AMD versus Intel episode in the making here, by the way. That's like the third episode idea I've gotten in the last 25 minutes here. So anyway, um, other key use cases while I'm thinking about it. So the other big one we've already talked about, AKS. Again, if you want to run Kubernetes on premises, you can do that using Azure Local, which is really great. I know especially developers really, really seem to like Kubernetes. it seems like I talk to way more developers that are deep into Kubernetes than I do system admins, right? And so I'm not really sure on the reasons why, but
Well, this is going back to what we were talking about before, is people lose sight that sysadmins on the ground, we stand up what we need to stand up to get our jobs done. And if the applications that our clients need, customers, in my case, doctors or whatever, if they're not running them on containers, then I'm not running containers. And it has nothing to do with how I feel about the technology. It's not solving the problem that I have, because the developers of that tech are not solving the problems that I have. So I don't know where all these, I mean, okay, I've seen like cryptocurrency things are being pushed out on uh containers. Great. Yeah, we're not doing that in our data center. That's not
no
happening.
crypto, no,
No, no, no,
not the
we're
blockchain.
not doing that. I even read a business oriented book on how to bring blockchain in and make it into here, and I'm just like, yeah, you're trying real hard, guys, because no, I'm not picking this up. But it's the same deal, is that I don't, as an admin, I'm not going out and just trying to find. One thing is you got to watch out for is the tendency, like, I have this really cool hammer. What am I going to hit with it? Right. And I've been in
Right,
places where they have done that, and they've just spent all this money on all this cool tech. And wow, that's really cool. And it does nothing. It does absolutely nothing. You have nothing to hit it with. So, okay. And containers are for that so far for a very huge segment of the world. And it's just like you just said, like, you run into these developers and like, wow, containers are so amazing, cool. I have deployed 0 into production so far, 0. So yeah, cool. There's a Kubernetes thing. You know why I haven't invested a whole lot of time in standing it up? Because I don't have a nail to hit that with. So
right. Yeah, I can see it I've seen it used in a couple of large SaaS type deployments and things like that, right? But yeah, on-prem, I don't think I've personally run into anything yet. And I could see if I'm like a large Fortune 500, I have some native homegrown application that I want to make it more fault tolerant, right? Kubernetes might be something I would look at in that situation.
but even
Again,
then, you come back to a lot of those things like you were saying before. And some a quote you'll hear me say a lot is, change only comes when the pain of staying the same
yep,
exceeds the pain of change.
yep.
You've got these big chunky internal apps that have been developed and whatever forever, and like, you'll go in and be like, wow, there's still a Fox Pro database underneath this one.
And the person that programmed it way back when was retired
His
5 years
children
ago.
have retired. Forget him. His children are done.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
but nothing is wrong with it. It still does the thing. So,
Wait, it's programmed in assembly language.
yeah. So
And
people are
nobody
sitting there trying to read it
understands
like,
it.
I don't know what this does.
Oh, man. Good times.
So for you're talking to these big orgs going here like, yeah, we're going to rip all that, put containers in. Like, no, you're not going to do that. That's not going to happen. Now, nobody sits down today and writes a net new program in assembly for this kind of major. Yeah, your new things going out, I can see that they're going in containers. That makes a lot of sense to me. But these big honking dudes who've been sitting around forever, no, they're running on whatever they were programmed in, and nobody touches them, because man, we just don't know what's going to happen.
Don't
So
breathe on it. That's right.
don't breathe on them. Don't look at them funny, because nobody can fix them.
Right. Um, Two other honorable mentions here. Well, I shouldn't say honorable mentions. I mean, they are use cases for Azure Local. Azure Local also allows you to basically do Arc enabled services. So Azure Arc is that piece that pulls in the on-premises workloads into the Azure management control plane, right? So you can do a lot of really cool things like anything around managed identity, for example. So managed identity inside of Microsoft Entra, you could really do some really fancy stuff with user account managed identity, system account managed identity. We could do a whole episode on this, but one example there would be, let's say I have a bunch of secrets that are saved inside of an Azure Key Vault. And I want to put some sort of automated process into place, right? And I don't want to manually type in these secrets every time. Well, using managed identity, I can have the on-premises virtual machine securely access those secrets via an automated process using managed identity via Azure Arc. And it's just it enables a lot of really neat use cases like that. So there's some Azure resource that you want the on-premises stuff to access. Azure Arc opens a lot of doors for that. And again, we're going to have to do a whole episode just on Arc. So there's episode 4 idea that we've come up with. And then you could also run
taking
SQL.
notes.
Yeah, I know, right? So you can also run a SQL managed instance and the new Azure IoT operations service on Azure Local as well. So that Azure IoT operations was newly announced at Ignite back in November. So I'll link to both of those services in the show notes. That way people who are interested can take a look at those.
Let's jump in with one more benefit because it didn't dawn on me. I mean, it was a lot of questions going on at Ignite. What about disconnected environments?
Yeah, good point.
And Azure Local they really thought that through, and I overheard a lot of really good conversations on the disconnected session. But I'm going to say the most exciting one was when I walked by and had an emergency responder vehicle there with an Azure Stack 2 rack in their trunk. And like, here is what they can accomplish. And this is a disconnected Azure Stack instance running on a server in the trunk of this emergency response vehicle. So people out there answering fires and, 911 calls basically are driving around. They got Azure Stack in the trunk and or Azure Local, I should say. Sorry, it'll take me some time.
It takes some time.
We've got Azure Local sitting in the trunk and doing so. Disconnected is a thing in case that's in your head somewhere that what about, and I even brought that up at one point too, is like cool that I live in a place where I have really reliable internet providers to choose from. I'm not too far from a lot of places that don't have that, and when they call 911, it's just as important as anybody in a city. What do we do for the ones where okay, somebody's out digging a trench and they take the entire city of whatever off the grid, some town you've never heard of in your life, they're off the grid now, and somebody calls 911 and that they've got Azure and they're all Azure services. Well, now what? They can't get to the internet. What are we going to do? Azure Local has had a lot of thought gone into it for that type of situation. I am not going to jump up and down and go, it's perfect, it's great. I still feel like Microsoft kind of has this internal belief that the internet will always be available. So I do want to throw a very, very big, large grain of salt into this. I think they've bet a little too hard on Azure, but they're at least listening to what folks like me are saying, that you cannot always guarantee the internet. It's not a given. And sometimes they're jumping up and down about, air gap systems. And I'm like, I don't mean air gap systems. I'm talking about systems that if the admin had his way, it would be online, but now it's out of his control. It's out of his power. A friend of mine who used to work in very rural Iowa would say link death over squirrel, because squirrel would go out and chew on the lines and now they're down for a week while they figure out where that hole is. And that's a thing. It happens. And I often don't feel like Microsoft has really got that. Look at Redmond if you've ever been there. It's insanely connected. What do you mean the internet down? What is that? They don't what? And yeah.
Is
So
LDOS, is that the acronym? Link death over squirrel?
He used that a couple times, yes. I had another LDOS. Sorry, I wasn't here for that. So
and it's funny you mentioned that, because I was just thinking, again, going back to the days where I was supporting a lot of manufacturing clients, I had one that they had a plant in the middle of nowhere. Like, there was one rinky-dink bar restaurant down the street, but other than that, there's nothing in any direction for 45 minutes, basically.
Right. And they matter too, and that's.
Yep. Good point. Very good point.
And I think a lot of the folks out there listening, like if you're in that 1% of people who have really bizarre situations, you know who you are, and you're already like, the wheels are turning how you're thinking about it. So yeah.
Not to mention, in those situations, you don't always get the best support from whatever rinky-dink ISP you're using at the time either, because I remember I had to call the support for an ISP for this location I'm thinking of. It was some, I don't know, like 1.5 meg down DSL type of thing. And they're like, oh, there's some problem with the line. We have to come out and take a look at it. I did all the troubleshooting I could. I knew it was something to do with their device or between them and their first hop, right? Anyway, the guy comes out and he's, you know, he takes the last drag on his cigarette and throws the cigarette in the parking lot, steps on it before he walks in. He walks into the room where the, you know, the entry point is for the DSL. And he stops. He rubs his beard. He looks at the modem. He's like, that light's not blinking. If it was blinking, it'd be working. And I'm like, yeah, like, could you help us out here? Anyway,
Great observation, sir.
I know. It just made me think of that particular situation. This little rinky-dink place in the middle of nowhere. That was fun times. In his defense, he did get it working, but his description of the issue was
no
interesting.
Blinky, or should be blinky.
Right? Light, no blinky. Anyway. So we've talked a lot about the features and the use cases, right? You know, I'm looking through the features list here to see if there's anything that we haven't talked about yet. You know, we talked about the core technologies. It can run Linux VMs. I want to make sure I say that. And Arc-enabled Linux VMs, which is really cool. So those Linux those Linux folks out there will be happy about that.
Yeah, that's something I don't think anybody really blasts out there loudly enough about
No.
just how well Linux works in a Microsoft environment. And some of it goes into our other thing that we were talking about before with like the VMware stuff. And yeah, VMware is not even in the same sphere as Microsoft when it comes to Linux support. They're really not. And working in a shop where I have to support Linux on both platforms, I'd much rather do it on Microsoft.
Well, so people that have known me for a long time know that I was a Linux admin in my very early sysadmin days. And the fact that I can spin up any major version of the Linux kernel today in any of the major distributions, and the Hyper-V modules are already there. Why? Because the Hyper-V team provides them to the Linux kernel directly.
It is
That's huge.
The kernel distribution. This is the right there, 90% of it, because it's already talking to everything as soon as you spin it up. There are things you do install to add functionality, but to make the thing work, it just works as soon as you turn it on. It's just done. There's no, I mean, and like one of the big thing that's in my head right now is the VM integration components, and how it just ruins my entire life when I have to redeploy them to a VMware cluster. I just don't.
Oh,
I just
yeah.
don't want to do that. It's just terrible.
So,
And with Hyper-V, it's just not an issue. You just
I was going to say, it's been a while since I've had to do any maintenance on a vSphere cluster. But do they still do the thing? I think you've done it more recently than me, Eric. But do they still do the thing where when you upgrade the hypervisor, do you still have to go in and upgrade the VMware tools manually after the fact on each
you
VM?
still have to do that. Even just they'll just release updates to the VM tools, and they cannot coincide with Windows updates because that has been known to cause all kinds of drama.
Right.
So there's 2 reboots coming. You know, your regular Windows patching and the VM tools, which why they have to patch a reboot every time. I'm like, are you really sure? Because I mean, all right, I'm not but I can replace my AMD video drivers without rebooting. What are you doing that I have to reboot for? Question mark. I don't understand that. And so like I actually had to sit down and build a script and go, okay, we want to try to automate this, but it's got to be during a downtime window. And so we had to do all these things to have it apply the VM tools when we wanted it to as administrators, because VMware's perspective is, well, the ESX administrators in charge. Why are they in charge? Not their server that's getting the tools. You know, they're yeah, and it's just complete disconnect. Microsoft just totally not an issue. The next time they do Windows updates, it's just taken care of. The next time they do Linux updates, it's just taken care of. You don't have to.
It doesn't even register in my brain, you know, because it's just taken care of, you know. So.
Yeah, you don't plan for it. You don't think about it. It's just going to happen. It is what it is because it's right there in the kernel. It's part of it. Yum update, enter, done.
There you go. Good times. So we spent a lot of time talking about Azure Local. I think we've given folks a good kind of high-level overview of it. In the coming episodes, I'm sure we're going to be diving into specific pieces more. I know I want to dive into Arc specifically. I think it'd be interesting to look at the IoT stuff too, because I have a passing interest in that. I have a lot of IoT devices in the house, actually. They're on their own subnet, but I digress. So that'd be a fun one to look into. I want to give folks some resources on, how to get started. So how do you get more information on Arc? Where should you go? The first thing I would recommend you look at is the Microsoft Learn document specifically on getting started with Azure Local. I'll put that link in the show notes. You'll also want to take a look at the Azure Local catalog, which gives you all of your certified hardware options specifically for Azure Local. And speaking of certified hardware solutions, I want to also link you, I think that same document, no, there's a separate page that has the system requirements. So I'll link that in the show notes as well, too. While I've got them in front of me, just a quick note on the system requirements. So supports between 1 and 16 machines. So pretty much in line with, clustering in the Windows world, up to 16 machines supported for, I think that's HCI supported up to 16 too, if I remember correctly. Don't quote me on that. I'm going off memory here. But up to 16 machines are supported. You need a 64-bit Intel Nehalem, I'm sure I'm butchering that, Nehalem grade or AMD EPYC or later compatible processor. Minimum 32 gigs of memory. Anything else that's specific here? A minimum boot drive of 200 gigs. 400 gigs or more is recommended for large memory local instances. You need at least 2 disks, minimum capacity 500 gigabytes for data drives, and you need a TPM version 2 chip. Optional for the GPU, up to 192 gigabyte GPU memory per machine. So that would be for that's a GPU I would want. That's a heck of a GPU. That's a cluster of GPUs there. But that's all for GPU-P, right? So I'll link the system requirements. There's more than that, but those are the high-level ones there. Let me get back to my show notes here. And I think we've covered everything that I want to cover. Anything I left out, Eric?
You know what? That's why we have more episodes. So
That's
fine.
right. That's right.
It looks good to me, though.
And we're about at time anyway, too. So like I said, I think that serves as a good kind of teaser. Gives you guys enough to get started. Give you some resources to get started. If you run into any specific trouble, any specific questions, anything you want us to dive into, again, I want to make this show very interactive. You can always reach us at contact@sysadminweekly.com. And it occurs to me that in the intro, I did not mention that this is a projectrunspace.org podcast. Can you tell I have not done the intro to the show very many times yet, Eric? This is a Project Runspace.
Twice more than I have. Does that help?
That's right. So projectrunspace.org is a nonprofit that Eric and I run, more so Eric than me. But it's designed to help folks get access to resources to help become better sysadmins. Eric describes it much better than I do, but hopefully I got the gist of it there in a short 10-minute soundbite. My whole point in bringing that up is you can go out to projectrunspace.org for additional IT resources. You can also go out to my blog, which is not updated as often as projectrunspace.org, but andyontech.com. With that, what do you think, Eric? Shall we wrap it up?
Call it a day. Let these folks get back to their other things.
That's right. Well, folks, thanks for spending some time with us. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to smash that like and subscribe button. We are available also on Spotify and a couple of the other major podcasting platforms. So chances are, wherever you consume your content, you can find the show. So with that, we'll let you get back to your day. Stay safe out there. We'll catch you again next week for another episode of Sysadmin Weekly. Have a good one.